we called for help, and they killed my son. That is a lament heard around the country in many of the more than 1,000 per year police killings. We call for help, and they killed my son. There are grievous stories ready to be read in the Boston Globe and other newspapers that tell exactly of this problem. A son or daughter or brother or father, maybe a wife or an aunt, is having a mental meltdown, a breakdown, where things are not going right in that person's spirit, in that person's heart and mind. And there is a call put out, 911, we need help. And the person who is the object of this care, and for whom care is being sought from the police, from perhaps the sheriff's department, that person ends up being killed because the officer understands that he is personally being threatened by the wild talk, by the holding of a knife or a club, or maybe even a weapon or something that looks like a weapon in the hand of the person whom we would typically call mentally ill or mentally unstable, or a PMI, a person with mental illness. And this problem is not just in the shedding of blood of American people who have not committed a capital offense. It is a problem also of dollars and cents as sheriff's departments and city governments try to deal with the deal with the care of and the interaction with these private people who have mental problems, or I would say spiritual and religious problems in the end. But either way, whichever word you use to describe their aberrance, right, their deviancy, they are often interacting with the public, with the organs of public administration, and often with police, and many of them end up dead. According to Alex Vitale, in his noted book that I'm in the middle of reviewing, The End of Policing, 25% of those people killed by police officers every year have a mental problem or a derangement of some kind. They're not on the range; they're off the range, right? That's derangement. They're not where they should be as normal people living out their lives. They're in bad places. They're stuck. They're in holes. They're on ledges. They are on the barbed wire, and a threat to themselves, perhaps, and sometimes, no doubt, a threat to others. And when the officer arrives with his rifle aimed or his pistol aimed, as often is the case, especially when that person is making angry and violent statements, he has his finger on the trigger, and he is ready to pull it. There was a case like this in East Ridge last year on August the 19th. There was an execution by Daniel Stevenson, a police lieutenant, of a plumber. His name was Todd Browning, and he was a resident of that city, and he was killed by five bullets at point blank by the officer who, following legacy tactics of police departments, in which there is a proprietary sense of ownership by the state actor of the private person, there is a lawful and defensible public extrajudicial summary execution of a citizen, in this case, point blank, very effective. Even as Todd Browning went down, Daniel Stevenson, to make sure he was going down, put a fifth bullet into him, probably in the back or side, as he fell there on the edge of the street. Because he had done the wrong thing, this man who had been in a rage and was now enraged beyond measure, holding a metal pipe, a plumbing tool, that Lieutenant Stevenson's defense attorney argued very strongly in the press was a lethal weapon about to be used on his client. Well, I would say that Todd Browning did have mental problems. He was certainly not rational. He was certainly not considering his own safety when an officer emerges from his police cruiser, his military cruiser, the lights on, and a long gun in his hands. Clearly, at that point, he should not have. He should have backed down. But what happens with policing, what happens with sheriffing, often is just the opposite. There is not a pacification. There is an increase in the anger, in the anxiety, in the sense of indignation of the party whom that officer is facing. And here we had a case where a man was clearly irrational. He had prior to his execution a scene in a car parts store, a chain store in East Ridge where he had threatened people, but he had nothing with which to hurt them. And so these threats were let go, and an officer who was shadowing him let him go out of the store. And then there was a confrontation in front of this man's house, and he was screaming something about his wife and children, and the officer kept screaming, "Don't step across that line! Don't step across that line!" And, the line in the sand theology, if you will, the state actor. It is a theology, by the way. It is a claim about who God is, and in this case, the officer is God, and you cannot go against him. And Mr. Browning irrationally and foolishly and incautiously crossed into the street. He crossed from the right of way, the grass, and touched the street, and that's when the bullets hit him. He went down. We have another example of a person who has done nothing to deserve capital punishment, slain in cold blood. And then more recently than that, at the hardware store parking lot in Saudi Daisy, across from the off-road transmission place, right there on the hill, Chris Sexton shot down by several county deputies. Again, a justified killing. In both cases, the district attorney and the sheriff or the investigating party saying that this was a lawful act. Now, lawful, but right, we have to ask. And the problem that we see of the use of force is I highlight the executions of these men. I highlight them because they are clearly not acting properly. They're clearly men with a derangement of their heart and minds. And though Mr. Sexton came out of his very nice pickup truck with a gun in hand and apparently aimed it, thus prompting the discharge of bullets against him, he did have a gun, and one could say justifiably that his death was inevitable, right? He had a mental problem. He had led officers on a chase that it was for 2 hours long into 2 counties, and he had prompted this encounter by violating an order of protection from his wife, whom he had hit and struck in violence. And so he was a man who had an ungodly temper, but B also had a derangement of his thoughts, and is now dead. There have been other cases as well where the use of force seems excessive, though it's always defended by the district attorney because it meets the statutory definition, and that definition in the statute says that there's a threat to the public, threat to others, or the officer, and if that threat is reasonable, seen reasonably, then the officer may execute that person on the spot. So we have legally defensible extrajudicial people. Executions of people who have not committed a capital offense. But its summary. It is a claim of the executive state against you, my listener, and against me, your host here, David Tulis, at Nooga Radio 92.7 FM. But now we have in the news today a remedy that highlights that problem, the mental health problem. And that remedy is a proposition made yesterday by Sheriff Jim Hammond before the county commission, seeking funds for a program that would keep at least some of the people with mental problems out of 2 facilities that he controls that are under his care. One is the jail downtown, and the other one is the Silverdale Correctional Facility, which is overseen by Core Civic under a contract. And the coverage of this development are favorable. The Times Free Press has assigned Judy Walton, probably the number 2 most important journalist in Chattanooga, to cover the event yesterday, and to write a story that looks into the background of why this proposal is it's high time that it be made, because we're dealing with people who are in trouble with the law, right? They're in a confrontation with the law, with the state actor, whether it's a police officer or a sheriff's deputy, a county sheriff's deputy. And what is the best outcome for this person? What can be the best for him, save on police time and save on space in the jail? The Chattanoogan story was rather summary report of that meeting. Points out that Sheriff Hammond told the commission that 7 individuals, a mere 7, had a cost to the system of $420,000, and they spent 4,000 days in jail. That's 10.9 years in jail with their problems. Now, these are people who are under a bond of some kind, and they can't make the bond. I don't know if they're convicted or if they're so-called pre-trial, which is unconvicted, right? Most people downtown are 2/3 are not convicted. 1/3 of those held in Silverdale are not convicted, right? They're waiting trial, and they're too poor to make bail. And the bail is intended in the law to guarantee a return to the court of the defendant. That's what all bail is for. It's not meant to be punitive, but in fact, as Sheriff Hammond realizes and is concerned about, it is in fact punitive, and it works devastation on the legal defense that poor people can make. If they're in jail, they can't make a defense. They can't maintain their jobs. They can't maintain their contacts. They can't really work to get perhaps pro bono help from a friend at church, or an attorney maybe willing to help them at a minimal charge. They just can't make any of these arrangements for their own defense if they're in jail, and they're in jail because they lack $100, right? They lack $400, $500 perhaps to make the fee for the bondsman. So they have a mental problem. They're stuck in jail, and some of them have very great medical needs, and they have a requirement for psychotropic drugs and the like. I got a letter a couple days ago from a prisoner in near Chattanooga in a state prison, and he's having a grave time getting medicines for diabetes, and shoes that fit his very wide feet, which are somewhat expanded because of his medical condition. So he's got many problems, health problems, and so here in Hamilton County, we have the same situation. And Sheriff Jim Hammond has proposed funding. He's asking for $25,000 initially. I think that's correct. He says the story in Chattanooga says Blue Cross, CHI Memorial, and the county are providing $25,000 each to pay upfront costs for a contract with a corporation of supportive housing to develop a program, one like that in Charlottesville, and there are 30 other cities that have a similar program, which includes $50,000 to the Corporation for Supportive Housing. That's the recipient of this money, and so a program will be developed. And the county is being asked to support this effort, again, because people in jail cost a great deal more than those people who do have their continuing problems, and they're in care of a corporation or assigned somehow by maybe by a judge, or maybe they're just there of their own volition. That it would certainly be better if you have mental problems to not be under some edict or other, but that you have as much liberty as possible to pursue your own care, your own benefits. The story by Judy Walton in the Times Free Press quotes Sheriff Hammond. Just 7 users we picked up at random, he says, over the last 5 years have spent more than 4,000 days in jail at about $420,000 cost to the county, and none of them are any better off than they were before we started this. Also, speaking at the county commission meeting yesterday was Robert Sherry, according to Judy's report, Vice President of Mission Integration for CHI Memorial. He says this is a holistic and just and compassionate way to approach these individuals, to try to intervene in their lives to make a difference and to change the trajectory both of their lives as well as the expenditures that revolve around their conditions. Now, there's a story that she mentions, Judy Walton mentions, in the Nashville newspaper, the Tennessean, and there a similar program is being proposed. It's a psychiatric emergency room that will be opening in 2018, and it's described as a more efficient way to treat people having mental crises and ease the pressure on police officers, saving officers from perhaps trying to solve problems on the spot that can't be solved probably ever. And the goal is to get the officer back out on the street in 10 minutes. So that since if police in fact have the duty of suppressing crime and solving crimes, then that duty will be better filled if officers don't have to have long engagements with people who are incoherent or who are seriously troubled. In Nashville, the goal is to get people connected to help more quickly. And the story says that police in that county or in that city spend $5,000 a year and responding to people in crisis. The story says that's between 2 and 3 full-time officer positions just on that one type of member of the public. In view is a $3.5 million facility that the story by USA Today Network writer Holly Fletcher says will be open to anyone who walks in or is dropped off and needs help. The project is getting $2.6 million from the Tennessee Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, about $500,000 from the city. The Mental Health Cooperative is putting in $447,000 for 20 beds. Now, what is the larger story here? I'd like to suggest that these are very favorable developments because what we want to have is, in the end, to have a prosperous local economy in Chattanooga and Hamilton County. There has to be less force overall. In other words, if people do things, it's not because they're coerced into doing them or forced into doing them, but because they do them voluntarily. And the idea being that if there's more liberty and less coercion, you'll have people who are overall happier. They will end up in circumstances and situations and maybe at addresses that suit them the best in their station in life. We have of course, people who are superior. We have people who are equal, right, to you, and then we have people who are inferior to you, right? Always in society there are what the Westminster Confession of Faith describes as equal, inferior, and superior. So the superiors in our county, those who are elected, right, who represent us, they are being appealed to. As Sheriff Hammond, of course, is a superior. He's being appealed to or making appeal on behalf of these people who are probably inferior to them, no doubt inferior to them, and probably inferior to you, my listener. Again, people who are poor, who have a custom of taking drugs. They're often addicted to drugs. They're addicted to prescription drugs, some of them, and some to illegal drugs. Many have alcohol problems. Many have, you might say, moral and perspective problems. Edward Banfield, in his book Unheavenly City, back in the 1980s, talked about the short-term time perspective of many poor people. People in ghettos think only of the immediate pleasure, the immediate gain, the immediate conquest, and don't really build anything for the future. They don't know how to save. They have many self-destructive habits, and they have these problems because I would suggest they're not thinking about other people, right? They're not obeying the admonition that Christians are always pushed to remember, and that is putting the other person first and putting yourself last, right? As Christ did for his people, the Christian who follows the Lord Jesus is required to do the same. And so we have this people, you might say, on the lower level of society, often poor, and they have frequent negative encounters with Chattanooga Police Department officers, East Ridge Police Department officers, Red Bank, Saudi Daisy. And so they're having these frequent interactions, and sometimes arrest just isn't the right thing. Even though a person may have violated the statute, even though a person may have done something which clearly fits into the disorderly conduct statute, which is unconstitutionally vague on, I think, 2 of its 5 provisions. They do something that's clearly in view there, not in the disputable part of that statute. And the officer, though, can exercise discretion, and that is something the officers do all the time. They come down hard on people whose breath they don't like, whose attitude they don't like, and then others who are perhaps gracious and kind and well-spoken, they let go, right? Or if they're white, they let them go. But if they're black and they seem scurrilous somehow, young black man in his 20s, no doubt he's up to no good, so let's give him a hard time. Officers have discretion, and here with the mentally ill, they have discretion, and hopefully under the police department's administration of David Roddy, there will be more de-escalation training, and it should be, de-escalation training, especially dealing with those who are mentally ill, should not just be a once in a lifetime, once in a career kind of thing. It should be a regular part of the program. And if reform is to take root in Hamilton County and Chattanooga, the order of business at some point will be reversed. Less emphasis on shooting, killing, tasing, drugging, and CS spraying people and taking them down and pinning them back and putting your knee in their neck. Less of that. Less need to say stop resisting, and more training on just conversation, how to deal with people who have problems, how to realize that we are doing better for the public if we take time with someone who's got some real problems and is not a criminal, right? Not a criminal. Especially, mentally ill people don't have any intent usually to violate the law. Intent is
the Tennessee Valley's news talk leader, Nooga Radio, digital FM 95.3 HD4 and 92.7